New York City was buzzing with political electricity. The Global Security and Development Forum, an annual event known more for handshakes than headlines, had just added an unexpected session to the agenda. A live debate between Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré and U.S. Senator JD Vance. It wasn't supposed to happen. Traoré had been invited as a keynote guest, expected to deliver another bold critique of Western influence in Africa. Vance was in the city to push his America First foreign aid reform bill and had requested to respond live. The organizers agreed. The room was now overbooked. World leaders, journalists, defense contractors, and student observers crammed into the UN side hall. Phones were up. Live streams rolled. On stage, 2 chairs waited, one draped in a Pan-African flag, the other backed by the Stars and Stripes. Then they entered. Traoré wore a simple dark suit. No tie, no notes. His presence alone pulled silence from the crowd. JD Vance followed in tailored navy, carrying a folder marked Africa Budget Reform Proposal. They shook hands. Briefly, the moderator spoke. Today's topic: does U.S. foreign aid to Africa support progress or perpetuate dependence? JD Vance leaned forward first. With all due respect to President Traoré, he said, it's time we admit the truth. American taxpayers have poured billions into Africa with little return. It's not sustainable. It's not accountable. And frankly, it's not our job to subsidize the rest of the world. Some applause erupted. Western media nodded. Then Traoré took the mic. Senator Vance, what you call aid, we call leverage. What you call support, we experience as control. And what you call investment often returns to you tenfold in influence, extraction, and military presence. The room stiffened. Africa isn't asking for your money, Traoré continued. We're demanding respect. We're rejecting the idea that your budgets should dictate our futures. Vance replied sharply. So you'd rather turn to China? Russia? Are those the partners you want for Africa? Traoré didn't blink. We'll choose our allies, not inherit them. The moderator cut in, struggling to contain the growing tension. But it was too late. The temperature had changed. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. The applause came in waves, fragmented and tense, not from agreement but from disbelief. No one had ever spoken to an American senator like that, on American soil, in front of half the world. JD Vance leaned back, lips pressed into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had been in televised debates before, but none like this. Traoré wasn't playing for Washington. He was playing for something bigger. For Africa, and the world was watching. Let's be honest, Vance said coolly. Much of this new Africa rhetoric is just anti-Western branding. Meanwhile, we send vaccines, engineers, infrastructure grants, Traoré cut in calmly, and soldiers, and satellites, and conditions attached to every coin. The moderator raised a hand. Traoré gestured to allow Vance to finish. Fine. Vance replied. You want sovereignty? I respect that. But sovereignty requires stability. And let's be real, Burkina Faso depends on aid. You cut that off, your hospitals go dark. Traoré's eyes narrowed. Senator, that's not support. That's a threat disguised as help. He stood, walking slowly across the stage as he spoke, not pacing, but claiming space. Do you think we don't know the price of your aid? Surveillance bases in our deserts? Trade deals we didn't write? Leaders overthrown when they said no. This isn't generosity. It's architecture. Colonialism rebranded. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some Western diplomats stared at the floor. Others typed furiously. Cameras zoomed in. JD Vance stayed seated, but his voice rose slightly. So what's your alternative? Let chaos spread? Invite Chinese debt traps in? Let Russian mercenaries rewrite your constitutions? Traoré turned. Our alternative is the right to choose, not between empires, but between futures. He stepped back toward his chair. The greatest danger to Africa isn't who we partner with. It's believing we always need permission to act. Silence. A young African delegate in the back stood and clapped once. Then again. Others followed. Not thunderous, not patriotic, but something older, something primal, respect. The debate wasn't over, but something had changed. This was no longer a question of aid. It was a question of identity. Outside the conference hall, the world was erupting. Clips of Traoré's response went viral within minutes. One line in particular, "This isn't generosity, it's architecture," was already trending across TikTok, X, and African student WhatsApp groups. In Accra, students gathered in university courtyards to watch replays. In Johannesburg, mural artists started sketching Traoré's silhouette mid-speech. And in Paris, young Africans in the diaspora flooded social media with one word: finally. Inside, JD Vance remained composed, but his team was scrambling. An aide handed him a folded note. "Fox News wants live reaction. CNN too. Stay sharp." He nodded, then leaned toward the mic. "Let's be clear, the United States doesn't need to control Africa. We're simply the only nation willing to pay the bill when no one else will." He turned his gaze on Traoré. "And your people, many of whom dream of coming to my country, know that." A murmur rippled through the hall. The implication was clear. If Africa is so independent, why do so many try to leave it? Traoré didn't flinch. "Yes, some dream of America, but not because of your generosity, because of your marketing. You built a dream factory, Senator. And for decades, you sold that dream while taking from the very lands you now say you support." He stepped forward. "But here's what terrifies you. That dream is losing its grip. We are no longer hypnotized. We're awake. And worse, we're speaking." JD Vance forced a tight smile. "I'm not terrified, Mr. President. I'm just unconvinced." "Then I'm not speaking for you," Traoré replied. "I'm speaking for those whose voices you never expected to hear in this room." The crowd stirred again, not from noise, from realization. Up in the media box, a BBC journalist whispered into his mic, "This isn't just a debate, it's a declaration. And Traoré is not here to win approval. He's here to change the conversation." And he was succeeding. By the time the fourth round of discussion began, the moderator had abandoned neutrality. Her scripted questions sat untouched as she tried to guide the conversation back to familiar ground: trade, infrastructure, aid accountability. But neither Traoré nor Vance were interested in diplomacy anymore. This was now a contest of narratives. JD Vance leaned into the microphone, voice steady but colder. "Let's not forget, Mr. President, many of the problems you're blaming on the West, corruption, coups, instability, those aren't made in America. They're homegrown." A few diplomats nodded. Traoré didn't argue. He nodded too, just once. "You're right. Not everything wrong in Africa comes from outside. But do you know what's worse than corruption, Senator? A system that rewards it." He looked directly at the American delegation. "You don't mind corrupt leaders as long as they sign your deals and host your bases." A low wave of discomfort rippled across the room. Vance smirked. "We prefer stability. You might call that realism." "I call it managed decline," Traoré snapped back. "You're not stabilizing us. You're slowing us down, just enough to stay ahead." "And yet your people still depend on our medicine, our tech, our food relief," Vance replied. "And you depend on our cobalt, our uranium, our land, our silence," Traoré shot back. Now it was JD Vance who tensed. "Let me guess, you want the West out entirely?" "No," Traoré said. "I want us to deal as equals, not as beggars to patrons." The moderator stepped in, voice tight. "Gentlemen, please." But the room wasn't unsettled. It was focused. This wasn't chaos. This was clarity. Meanwhile, Global analysts were already reframing the moment. At Al Jazeera, a headline went live: Traoré redefines African sovereignty on U.S. stage. At Fox News, Traoré blames U.S. for Africa's failures, JD Vance pushes back. But on TikTok and Twitter, no framing mattered. Only the clips did. And they spoke for themselves. Not as beggars to patrons. You built a dream factory. We'll choose our allies, not inherit them. The lines weren't just going viral, they were being remembered. The fifth exchange between Traoré and Vance felt different. The crowd wasn't reacting as if they were witnessing a debate anymore. They were witnessing a shift. Old language no longer held the same authority. Words like stability, security, aid. They rang hollow when placed beside Traoré's sharp, unyielding voice. JD Vance sensed it too. He pivoted. You speak of sovereignty, he said, but sovereignty doesn't feed children. It doesn't vaccinate villages. It doesn't stop terrorists. Neither does dependency, Traoré replied calmly. Then he paused, walking slowly toward the edge of the stage, facing the audience. Not Vance. I've seen what you call stability, he said. I've buried soldiers killed with weapons we didn't make, in conflicts we didn't start, for resources we don't even own. I've visited clinics built by foreign aid, only to find medicine locked behind donor restrictions. I've met farmers told to grow exports they'll never eat, in soil they can't afford to lose. He turned back to Vance. And still we're told we must earn the right to stand on our own land. Vance exhaled through his nose, half frustration, half calculation. Look, I don't think Africa should be owned, but neither should it be romanticized. You lead a country fighting insurgents on multiple fronts. Are you saying that cutting off U.S. support would make you stronger? I'm saying, Traoré answered, that strength built on silence isn't strength. It's survival, and we're tired of surviving. The audience leaned in. Even the moderator didn't interrupt this time. Empires fall, Traoré continued, not because they're defeated in war, but because they run out of stories people are willing to believe. He stared at Vance now, not with anger, but something sharper, conviction. The story of America as savior is fading, Senator. What comes next is up to you and to us. Silence. Then applause, not thunderous, but dense, heavy, a slow rising wall of sound, from diplomats, youth delegates, even a few members of the American press. And somewhere deep in Washington, a strategist watching the live feed muttered under his breath, "This guy's not just a president, he's a movement." Hours after the debate ended, its impact was already pulsing through headlines, group chats, and government briefings from Nairobi to New York. In West Africa, young leaders called it a turning point. In Washington, foreign policy aides called it a problem. And in the digital world, it was a wildfire. Clips of Traoré's speech racked up millions of views. Memes exploded. A viral thread listed every U.S. military base in Africa beneath Traoré's quote, "Strength built on silence isn't strength." In contrast, JD Vance's soundbites, "Sovereignty doesn't feed children. Are you turning to Russia?" were met with criticism, satire, and even mock edits casting him as the new voice of Western paternalism. The internet had chosen its victor. But inside a private State Department meeting, the mood was far from amused. "We invited him," a senior official said bitterly. "We gave him the stage. And he used it better than we ever have," someone else muttered. Analysts argued over response strategies. Should they ignore Traoré, counter his claims, reframe U.S. aid, leak something? Nothing felt sufficient because deep down, they all knew the truth. This wasn't just about what Traoré said, it was how people heard it. Meanwhile, Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was reading reports, regional intelligence briefings, cyber threat assessments, internal memos from allies warning of quiet retaliation. "They won't strike publicly," Aminta told him, "but they'll strike." He nodded. "Then we stay louder than their silence." Colonel Dow entered holding a phone. "We're getting requests for interviews," Al Jazeera, South African Broadcasting, even Brazil. Traoré looked up. Accept them, but not to repeat myself. Then what? To escalate. At a conservative think tank in Washington, JD Vance met privately with donors. He didn't speak much, just listened, took notes, then finally said, "He didn't beat me with facts. He beat me with faith." Faith in what? One asked. Vance stared at the floor. That his people don't need us anymore. The debate was over, but the message had only just begun to echo. Days after the debate, something unexpected began to take shape. Not in New York, not in Washington, but in Dakar, Lusaka, and Addis Ababa. African ministers who rarely agreed on anything were suddenly quoting Traoré. Civil society leaders, tech entrepreneurs, student unions, all repeating variations of the same line. Strength built on silence isn't strength. What began as a single debate became a movement. Stand like Traoré trended for 3 straight days across the global south. And then came the real shock. The foreign minister of Brazil reached out to Burkina Faso's delegation with a proposal, a South-South development summit. No Western donors invited. Then Indonesia, then Bolivia, then South Africa. By the end of the week, 8 nations had signed on to co-host. Inside Traoré's modest situation room in Ouagadougou, the mood was focused, not celebratory. They're going to take this personally, Aminta warned, laying down a report stamped with U.S. embassy markings. Let them, Traoré replied. We never asked for permission. Why would we need forgiveness? Colonel Dow pointed to a wall map. Dots marked American security partnerships across West Africa, surveillance posts, training programs, logistics hubs. You've started a chain reaction, he said. They might shut us out. Good, Traoré said. That means we're finally on our own. In Washington, the State Department scrambled to contain the fallout. They're calling it non-alignment 2.0, an analyst said. But it's worse, they're aligned now, just not with us. JD Vance watched from the shadows, quieter than usual. His advisors offered spin tactics, op-eds, counter-forums, responsible engagement rhetoric. But Vance didn't take the bait. If we fight this the old way, we lose, he said. Then what's the move? Someone asked. He stared at a paused clip of Traoré mid-speech. We stop trying to teach them and start learning what we missed. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré received one last message that night. A handwritten note from a student in Ghana. You didn't just win a debate, you gave us the language we needed to stop begging. He folded the note carefully. For the first time since New York, he smiled. Washington doesn't sleep on symbolism, and Ibrahim Traoré had become one. In think tanks, embassy briefings, and closed-door intelligence meetings, the new consensus was clear. Traoré wasn't just a troublesome populist. He was now a narrative threat, a man capable of reshaping how the world viewed American power. The State Department prepared talking points. USAID revised public messaging in the Sahel. Pentagon advisors warned of ideological contagion. At Langley, a senior analyst didn't mince words. He's not waging war on our military. He's waging war on our credibility. JD Vance, meanwhile, remained eerily silent. He declined interviews, ignored op-ed offers, and yet his name kept showing up, mostly in editorials painting him as either the man who lost the debate or the one who finally exposed the limits of American arrogance. Privately, his office drafted a memo, Reassess U.S. Approach to Post-Colonial African Leaders Who Reject Traditional Aid Paradigms. The title was dry. The implication wasn't. Across the ocean, Traoré received an invitation, not from a government, from Cornell University. A student organization asked if he would speak, via livestream, to an international audience of African diaspora youth. The event sold out in 6 hours. Aminta hesitated. It could be bait, or it could escalate the pressure. Traoré didn't flinch. Then we go louder. The live stream aired on a Thursday evening. His speech was titled, "We Are Not Your Project." He spoke for 18 minutes. He wasn't angry. He was surgical. "You offered us roads, but mapped them toward your ports. You offered us clinics, but told us which pills we could use. You offered us schools, but censored which histories we could teach. What you never offered was equality." The response was volcanic, not from governments, but from people. Young Africans, Latinos, Southeast Asians flooded comment sections, not with flags, but with questions. Why did we never ask this before? Why were we always told to be grateful? What else have we accepted as normal? In a private email chain between NATO-aligned diplomats, one line stood out. "We underestimated what one African voice could do when it refused to echo us." What cannot be silenced publicly is often undermined privately. As Traoré's message continued to gain momentum, spilling from social media into universities, policy panels, and even parliaments, a different kind of response was quietly mobilizing behind closed doors. Burkina Faso's embassies in 3 European capitals reported sudden delays in trade negotiations. Western NGOs paused development partnerships without explanation. A joint military exercise, once hailed as strategic cooperation, was abruptly postponed due to scheduling conflicts. Aminta was the first to see the pattern. "They're trying to choke us without admitting it," she told Traoré. "Not with sanctions. With silence, that's fine," he replied. "We were never building our future on their schedule." But then came something deeper. Anonymous reports began surfacing on international outlets, allegations of human rights abuses in the Sahel, claims that Traoré was silencing opposition voices, a vague UN memo citing concerning developments in press freedom. None were fully confirmed, none fully denied, but the damage was done. Colonel Dow slammed the report down on the conference table. "They're trying to smear your name before the summit. Discredit the message by staining the messenger." Traoré read in silence, then looked up. "If they think we'll break for the sake of their approval, they still don't understand what this is." "Then what is it?" Aminta asked. He stood, walking to the window overlooking the capital. "It's not about Burkina Faso anymore. It's about the story we represent. And stories like this," he tapped the report, "only prove our point." Back in Washington, JD Vance reviewed a private intelligence brief. He didn't smile when he saw the strategy. He didn't nod when they showed polling data about declining trust in Traoré. He simply asked, "If we discredit him, what replaces him?" Silence. No one had an answer, because there wasn't one, not yet. In Africa, murals kept going up. In Brazil, students planned solidarity marches. And in a dozen capitals across the global south, one phrase began appearing on posters, screens, and lips. "You can't cancel a continent." The day of the Pan-South Summit arrived, not hosted in Washington, London, or Paris, but in Lomé, Togo. Chosen deliberately, a small capital without colonial grandeur, symbolic of a new global direction. No G7 observers, no IMF handlers, no press kits vetted by Western PR firms. But they came anyway, not the officials, but the people. Delegations from over 20 African, Latin American, and Southeast Asian nations attended. So did hundreds of activists, scholars, farmers, and artists. The halls were wired not for hierarchy, but for harmony. At the heart of it all, President Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't speak first or second, he listened. And when his time came, he stood not behind a podium, but among the crowd. No suit, no notes, just presence. "You called me a populist. I called you mistaken. You said I was young. I said youth is power. You tried to remind me of your generosity. I chose to remind you of your history." He paused, not for applause, but for weight. You asked what we want what you claim to stand for, but never gave us. Sovereignty without conditions, partnership without supervision, and most of all, dignity without expiration." The crowd rose before he finished, not to celebrate him, but to stand with him. No anthem played, no jets flew overhead, but something louder happened. A consensus, unspoken, undeniable, took shape in that moment. Africa would no longer ask. It would declare. Far away in a Washington news studio, JD Vance was asked again what he thought of Traoré's rise. He didn't answer with cynicism. He didn't dismiss it with policy talk. He just said, "We were used to telling the world its story. Now the world started telling its own." The debate was over, but the echo had become permanent. Not between two men, but between two continents. And for the first time in generations, Africa wasn't answering questions. It was asking them. This wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror, held up not only to power, but to history. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before JD Vance, he wasn't confronting a man. He was confronting a mindset, a model, a legacy built on borrowed voices and assumed superiority. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply refused to echo. And that refusal became a rallying cry, not for Burkina Faso alone, but for every nation that had been told to sit quietly while others dictated their future. JD Vance represented the old world, structured, strategic, and afraid of losing control. Traoré stood for something new, a world no longer waiting for permission to speak. They debated policies, but what they really fought over was narrative. And when the echoes cleared, only one voice remained. Africa will no longer kneel. We are not your project. We are your equals. This was more than a moment. It was a message. And now, it belongs to the world.